Hello, and welcome to the next in our series of lessons on plants for the subject Life Sciences. In our past lessons, we have covered several aspects, and we're going to be building on those aspects with what we are going to do today. We've already looked at plant tissues, plant anatomy, and we started looking at plant functioning. And what we're going to do today is we're going to carry on looking at how plants work. And the topic is we're looking at transport systems in plants, more specifically how water is moved around the plant. The question we're going to be looking at is, when you water a plant, you pour water on the soil. And yet it's the leaves that actually need the water because they need the water for photosynthesis. So let's look at how this works. In our past lessons, we have looked at the structure of a plant, and we also looked at leaves, how leaves lose water through transpiration. The question is, where do the leaves get the water? And that's what we're going to be looking at today, because the water obviously is absorbed by the roots and then it is transported up by the stems. So that's what we're going to have a look at today. We're going to be looking at roots and stems and how they deal with water. To be able to understand the section, you need certain basic concepts from the lessons we've done in the past, namely, what types of tissues do we find in a plant, what do they look like, where they're found. But we also need to revise certain concepts from cells, which is a process called diffusion, and another process called osmosis, which I will revise with you in a short while. Looking at the plant, what we did in one of our previous lessons, we look at roots, stems, and leaves. And in those roots, stems, and leaves, we have the different types of tissues. So let's highlight where these different types of tissues are found. So if we look in the root, we see the dermal tissue. And the most important thing we're looking at now is the vascular tissue in the center, namely the xylem and phloem. If we look at the stem, the vascular tissue is found in the vascular bundles where the xylem and phloem is. And if we look at the leaf, we have the main vein and the side veins, which have the vascular tissue, because it's the vascular tissue that is actually going to be doing the transporting of water. Last lesson, we looked at how leaves lose water in transpiration, and this lesson we're going to look at how does the water get to the leaves, namely through the roots and the stem. To be able to understand this, you need to remember the basic structure of a root, and I'm just briefly going to revise that, focusing on the parts which are important for water transport. So if we have a look, we have the epidermis on the outside with, very importantly, the root hairs to absorb the water. We've got this layer, which is the cortex, and that's mainly for storage. Then in the center, we've got the xylem with the phloem, and then the endodermis and pericycle around the vascular cylinder. In this section, most important, these little things, root hairs. And they're long and thin, and they increase the surface area of the root by 10 times, which means it can actually absorb 10 times more water than if there were no root hairs. If we look at this plant, it is showing a plant absorbing something through its roots. But it's not only water that plants absorb, it's also minerals. And let's have a look at which minerals will the plant actually need to absorb along with the water. So if we have a look at that, okay. From your natural science early on in grade 8 and 9, you should know that K is an element called potassium. Another element in the soil that is absorbed is P, which is phosphorus. And then the third most important one is N, which is nitrogen. And those are the three most important minerals that plants absorb. They do absorb a whole range of other ones, but these are the most important ones. Now, how do these get into the root? Easy. Simple diffusion. And diffusion occurs when substances move from a high concentration to a low concentration. But the problem with diffusion is, when concentrations are equal, it stops. So not all the minerals in the soil would be able to be absorbed, but plants have another method. And that is they use something called active transport. And this you should have done in your section on cells as well. Active transport occurs when special carrier molecules use energy to get needed substances into the plant, even if it's from a low to a high concentration. So let's have a look at this. Here we have our needed minerals. This is the cell membrane here, and that is our carrier protein. The minerals attach to the carrier protein. You can see them here. And the carrier protein uses energy to move those minerals to the inside of the cell, and they can then move into the cytoplasm and be used for whatever it's needed. Important is that energy is needed, and active absorption is always against a concentration gradient, meaning either from a high to a high concentration or from a low to a high concentration, which is exactly opposite to what happens in diffusion. Well, we've done an introduction to looking at how plants deal with water, and we've started looking at the root. But before we go any further, I think your brains need a break.